Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this discussion, A Sense of Place, How to Create Community in a Fractured World. Never more important, I think. This is part of the Belonging and Community strand, so you can follow some of these ideas throughout the day. Like many Battle of Ideas discussions, although they're urgent and pertinent, they're not in a kind of conducted in a black and white way. Are we for or against community is not the discussion here today. The way this works is that we have 5 speakers on the panel. They'll each say about 5 minutes as an introduction, a sort of whetting your appetite, and then we'll have a conversation with you. We're very interested in what you think. You don't have to just ask questions, you can make points. We're also very lucky to be partnering with the Belonging Forum on this, a really interesting organisation that I urge you to check out after. But we're also very lucky to have Kim Samuel, the founder of it, speaking on the panel. She'll speak first. She's the founder of the Belonging Forum and author of On Belonging, Finding Connection in an Age of Isolation. You may have noticed it in the corridors of this of the church house, and I do urge you to read a copy. She's an educator and an activist. Following Kim, we'll hear from William Clouston, who's the party leader of the Social Democratic Party, the SDP. We'll then hear from Abbot Christopher Jamison. He's the Abbot president, the English Benedictine Congregation, and he's the author of this rather beautiful book, Finding the Language of Grace, Rediscovering Transcendence. We'll then hear from Michael Merrick. He is Director of Schools at the Diocese of Lancaster. He's a former teacher and an education and social commentator. And I was reminding him this morning of a program he did on Radio 4 some years ago when he had ginger hair, he tells me, really interesting on ideas about community and home and the stresses on people to move away from their community today. And then we'll hear from Dave Clements. He's a writer and policy advisor, and he's a contributing co-editor of The Future of Community. Again, a very interesting book. So a lot to get stuck into. But Kim, if I could just ask you to kick us off with your 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. I want to begin now, Tiffany, with what you just asked us. Of course, it's not controversial, community or not community, but sometimes I think it is. It's about who belongs, who is seen to belong in a community and who isn't. And I think about this in terms of an individual who feels like they don't belong, or newcomers who are made to feel that they don't belong, even though the rules and regs may make it look like they do. I wanted to. That was not my planned beginning, and it is. But it made me think about this. On the outset, it's not controversial, but sometimes it is. For me, a world, a village, a street with belonging is where everyone can feel that they belong. And if they don't feel that way, then just by my perspective, it's not a belonging community. I wanted to, you mentioned my book very kindly, and other books written by my fellow panelists. I want to just recite a title of a book that was written in 1967 by Martin Luther King. I'm sure some of you, maybe a lot of you, know about it. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And that book, which is still available, of course, contains a lot of essays about work, about education, about things that we all have a right to, and yet if we're not able to experience that, including what I see as the right not to live in poverty, then the belonging part can be hard. I simply will define belonging as that feeling of being at home wherever you are, having a sense of agency, a sense of place, and I would add a sense of grace, to be seen as yourself and show up as yourself, But I also feel very strongly that this relates to entire groups of people who are marginalized all the time, including in the UK, where asylum seekers officially don't exist. How can you belong if you don't exist? I came up with something not very original. The letter P. Today is brought to you by the Belonging Forum and the letter P. A sense of belonging is about our connection to people, to place, to power, and to purpose. And I know that this panel is about sense of place, but I feel that they're all very much interconnected. And these can be the places where we work and where we choose to work from. These can be places of worship for people of faith. These can be schools and kids, as well as educators who may feel bullied and so on and so on. But it also has to do with resources, financial resources and other resources that go into making community. So while I believe each of us as individuals have both rights and responsibilities to be part of community, if we don't see the resources go, for example, to things that at least I used to take for granted, having a post office near where I lived, being able to do my banking or go to the chemist and talk to a human. What a novelty today, and that we need to really to stand up and fight for these. I realize I've got 1 minute, so I am going to surprise someone, two beings in this audience, Mikey Holland Spook, to say, to give you an example of what belonging and community are in action. Mikey happens to be a dear friend, as is Spook, and his wonderful dog, the best trained dog in the UK. And they hail from a village called Bridgefoot in the Lake District. And Mikey recently moved back there, and he went to the village hall. So much to talk about village halls. And he and Spook went to the every week, every couple of weeks, where you can go and get your dog trained, because someone that he went to school with probably forever, up through teenage years, she runs this in the village hall. And they went there, and the trainer said, well, what do you Spook is Spook. He's all trained and this and that. What? I just wanted to check it all out. He went again, Spook and Mikey, the next time, and all the same people were there. Yes, if you need your dog trained, you can go there too. But the point of it is that people keep going back and back and back for community. And to end on, I have a student colleague at Oxford University. She's just gone to York, but that's besides the point. She took an art class. She was feeling really lonely. She took an art class. She chose one in a village in Oxfordshire, because all of the people there were much older, and we look at things with something that we did called the belonging barometer, and looking at groups of people that tend to feel a lack of belonging all the time. She wanted to be there. She's an artist. She was already an artist. Her name's Pranika Anand. She finished the art course. She showed me what she did. I said, this is great, but you're really good. You're an artist. Or don't you want to go on to the next one? She said, no, I want to go back to this one. I've made friends. It turns out no one in that course in years has ever left level 1. So I just wanted to give you a couple of things to think about there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. William.
Good to be here. Thank you. A few observations first. I think the disconnectedness, social isolation, loneliness that we're experiencing is a worldwide phenomenon. Atomization, for instance, is a major challenge currently for the Chinese Communist Party, just as it is the epidemic of poor mental health is a challenge in the West. Deracination, semi-nomadic lives, dormitory towns, and empty churches are the products of modernity, or at least these are the destinations where the modern world has led us. Material wealth combined with spiritual weakness. I don't think human beings have changed so much as the conditions that we live in have changed. What we've lost is a life in common, or of being together. A desire to be together still exists, I think, but it's harder to fulfill. So a few days ago, I was in the Oxfam bookshop at Keswick, and I spotted a book which on its spine said Yearbook for Scotland, 1961. I picked it up. I wondered what it was. It was the Tory party's Yearbook for Scotland. It was 380 pages of committees, of honorary chairmen and branch treasurers and so on, all over Scotland. It was massive. It's an astonishing book, and I was flicking through it. The Conservative Party at that time had 2.5 million members. Astonishing levels of participation. I looked into the next house to me, my house in Orkney, and found the name of the treasurer who was actually in charge. It was astonishing. That's long gone. It's a fraction of that now. Ben Cobley recently wrote in The Critic, "The habits of participation, chairing meetings, minute-taking, now seem arcane and irrelevant to many. And so many of these little groups simply dissolve and melt away, leaving a vacuum in their place." That vacuum, I think, is being filled with technology, and in particular, people gazing endlessly at screens of various kinds. Smartphones intervene between people, literally, quite often, people leading parallel lives at the same dinner table. That's what we're faced with. And this addiction leads to cognitive deterioration, anxiety, depression, loss of sleep, loss of concentration. 1/4 of 5 to 7-year-olds now have smartphones. They're designed to be addictive. Personally, I think smartphones should be banned for the under 16s. Other solutions. First, place. Quote, "For most people, the meaning of their lives is a local affair." That's John Gray. I think he's right, as he is on virtually everything. Solutions, I think, will always be local at the parish level. There's a new film out called The Outrun. It was based on a book by an Orcadian author called Amy Liptrot. And she wrote about her experiences in London as a young person dealing with alcoholism. And she left and went back to Orkney, where she was from, to deal with it, to get over it. And the most interesting insight in that whole book was the fact that in Hackney, in her late 20s, her friendship group was actually very narrow. It was basically people of her age, of a similar outlook, with similar habits. Curiously, when she went to Papa Westray, there was only 80 people there. So you had to interact to work, so the island works. And so counterintuitively, social life in Hackney was actually very insular. Social life in Orkney was very varied. Key insight. So I think the solution will always depend, to some extent, on somewhere. It depends on a place. Secondly, communion. As a society, I think we're doing as well as any society could, which is in a process of losing its principal belief system. During the 2019 election campaign, I was at Leeds University Hustings, and a student asked me, what is the SDP going to do about my mental health? And I talked about the NHS. What I should have done is ask the student, had they considered going to church? Maybe that would have gone down worse. But what I'm getting at is that the church used to provide this spiritual foundation. And I actually attend church. I think for me, it's about belonging, not belief. I don't believe, but I do attend. Lord Home once asked Harold Macmillan if he could put his finger on the point in time when the slide in values in Britain began to set in. His answer came without hesitation: the day that people stopped going to church on Sunday morning. I think that's probably right. So finally, I'd like to end on an optimistic note. I think beneath the surface, there are communities wanting to be convened. And during the lockdowns and the pandemic, in my own home village in Corbridge in Northumberland, we organised support groups basically for people that needed prescriptions or food or whatever. And we were absolutely inundated. We divided the village into sections, and the level of volunteering, I'd never seen it before. It was absolutely astonishing. So in a crisis, people really rallied round. We couldn't deal with the level of volunteering. So in a crisis, there was a massive urge to participate. And I think that showed a latent desire to be in a community and be part of it. I think it's there, and our job is actually to find it and convene it.
Thank you. Christopher.
Thank you to Kim and to William for opening up the topic so well. And I hope I can take the discussion in a slightly different direction because I want to speak to you about ping pong, table tennis, or as Boris Johnson once famously called it, whiff-waff. And how can this create community? But before coming to that, I'd like us to think about freedom, in particular the difference between freedom from and freedom to. Freedom from restrictions is the dominant understanding of freedom in Western culture today. This is understandable because the removal of restrictions that expressed racial and gender prejudice has been one of the triumphs of modernity. But like a blowtorch that is used to remove paint from wood, once the paint has been removed, if you continue to use the blowtorch on the wood, you will burn it and eventually destroy it. This is what freedom from has become. Once used to remove prejudice and injustice, it has now become all-consuming. The path to freedom has become identified with the removal of all restrictions. Freedom from is summed up by the phrase, "Leave me alone." But the outcome of this wish is precisely that you are alone. So this negative view of freedom fosters the growth of loneliness experienced by so many people. By contrast, freedom too offers a future where people are not left alone. Freedom to do what is the question this raises. My answer is summed up in the phrase, "Count me in," the opposite of "leave me alone," by which I mean count me in to help create community. Freedom, too, is here understood as freedom to pay attention to other people, to pay attention to other people. In his recently published book entitled On Freedom, Timothy Snyder asserts that freedom is about knowing what we value and bringing it to life, and that involves other people. He goes on to say that virtue is an integral part of freedom, that is to say, the habit of paying attention to others can be cultivated and learnt and should be a key feature of education. A path between leave me alone and count me in has appeared in the form of the digital world, which William's already referred to. Here, somebody can apparently be both physically alone and digitally connected. If freedom is paying attention to others, then can the digital world be part of that? At a level of communicating information, such as come to the meeting next Monday, yes. But at the level of really meeting people, no. And the risk here is that paying attention to my device replaces paying attention to others, even at the dinner table, as William said. The digital world can make connections, but it cannot make relationships. And that takes me back to where I began, table tennis. How table tennis can build relationships. A man in Brighton had a talent for table tennis and competed at national level. So he set out to use this talent as a way of paying attention to other people in Brighton where he lives. He set up the Brighton Table Tennis Club. I recommend their excellent website, with an emphasis on paying attention to people on the margins. This includes people with physical disabilities. 2 members of the club won medals at this year's Paralympics in Paris, one of them aged 14. There is dementia table tennis and table tennis for the children of refugees who feel so isolated. And while some kids play, other family members are in the cafe that is one of the club's partners, learning how to cook healthy food. Something as humble as a game with a plastic ball and wooden bats and a table can be an expression of freedom that pays attention to others. To see other possibilities of growing community, We need to move beyond freedom from restrictions, not leaving it behind, not forgetting it, but realizing that freedom to pay attention to others is the real freedom we need today to build community.
Thank you. Michael.
Thank you very much. I feel a little bit of a fraud here. I don't necessarily have the intellectual and spiritual and kind of academic input. My main reason for being here is I did that very modern thing of having a series of kind of deeply personal reflections and posting them all over Twitter. And those reflections were that I was lonely. I felt a period of time where I felt lonely, and I opened up on that. So I wonder if I'll just trace that a little. So, I mean, essentially, me and my wonderful wife decided to treat ourselves. We have 7 children. We need respite now and again. We took a trip to Settle on the train. Carlisle to Settle. It's beautiful. I recommend it. It's cheap, affordable. It's very good. And we went, lovely day, raining, went into a pub. And in this pub, I still remember, actually, cheese pie and gravy. It was delicious. But next to the fire were 4 men, just supping their pints, doing absolutely nothing. Just sat, just talking, just shooting the breeze. And I looked at them and I thought, that reminds me nothing so much as my own childhood, of my granddad, my dad, the dominoes, the billiards, the bridge club, the cricket club, the Legion, the social, mass. And I thought, I don't have that. I don't have that. I'm lonely. And when I say lonely, I don't mean alone. I mean, I don't have male companionship. Now, of course, as soon as you open up that door, in comes, these feelings of envy also come accompanied by a load of guilt. Because you think, well, is something wrong with me? By all accounts, I'm doing okay, professionally doing all right. I've got a family who are wonderful, who I love to bits. Are they suddenly not enough? Is this what midlife crisis is? Am I about to go and get my ears pierced? But actually, I think it was possibly a bit more than that. I think it was possibly a reflection of the fact that my life had followed a different path to my gramps and to my dad. And with that have come trade-offs. See, my life was a bit more rootless. I followed the social mobility dream. I moved around. I followed the career path. I looked after my family. I was provider. I was protector. And I thought I was doing the right thing. But the trade-off was that I lived a fairly shallow existence in friendships and in place. And that comes back to bite. So anyway, like I say, I took to Twitter, shared that with the world. And I've got to say, the engagement blew me away. I thought I might be a little bit of a minority. And that wasn't the case at all. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of replies and actually lots of private messages too, 143 all told, because I tried to respond to them all. And if I'm honest, it was naive. There were some guys who were really struggling and I didn't have the ability to help. But one thing that came up time and time and time again was, this speaks to me. I've got a family, love and adore my children, my wife. I'm doing okay at work, and there is a hole. There's something missing, and I don't know how to speak about it. So, I mean, from that experience, there was at least something positive to know that it wasn't just me, that this is something more broadly, and the demographic that I had in mind, the kind of similar to me, it seemed like it wasn't something we're talking about a great deal. And so from there, possibly just a few reflections, if that's okay, just to kind of grease the wheels a bit. Firstly, so much stuff, when I started looking into this, so much stuff keeps on telling blokes to talk. And I do get it, it's good. But actually, I would feel like I didn't really want to talk. It just felt, I don't want to seem kind of like caveman, but it just felt a bit cringe. What I wanted was stuff to do. I wanted to be with people and do stuff and just kind of know that somebody's got my back like I've got theirs. That was a big thing. Next, and this is, well, it's about the midlife crisis thing. I adore my Mrs. Merrick. She's absolutely wonderful. But I do wonder if my commitment to try and be a good dad and a good husband meant that my life was work, home, office, home. That was the way I was being the modern man. That's the way I was fulfilling my obligations to my family. And I wonder now if that has just concentrated down my social relationships to such a narrow circle, in a way that when I speak to my wife about this, she doesn't feel. Because ironically, she raised the children. She gets out to groups all the time. She meets loads of people. And that wasn't something that I had. So I wondered if there was something there and that needs an action. But we men aren't great at going and being sociable because, again, cringe. So And then, two last quick thoughts. Anybody who knows me knows that I will rant about social mobility given half the option. But there is a reality here. And the reality is that within education, and picking up on the Abbot's comments here, for so long we've had this kind of Odyssean myth of self-empowerment that education is freedom. It's freedom to raise above and beyond. It's freedom to leave. I mean, even the language we use, to not be constrained or restrained by your background or your circumstance or your parents' wages. I just think we get that wrong badly. Firstly, we get it wrong what it means to be educated. To be educated isn't to be free of everything. For me, it means to be more deeply embedded, more inculcated, more kind of inducted into the wider society and culture around you. But secondly, we get it wrong because, as I said in the talk that Tiffany referred to, it kind of means that success means not being like your mum or dad. And that means leaving. It means going away, getting your degree, going to find the grad jobs and going to the places where the grad jobs exist, which is quite often, I grew up in Stockton-on-Tees. It's not there. It's somewhere else. So social mobility is a factor here. And the last thing, the church. So when I spoke yesterday, I have this terrible habit that I sometimes, I manage, my mind runs away from me and I put things in great kind of metaphysical kind of terms. And I talked yesterday in education about the problem of disenchantment and alienation. And I like to think I've got quite a robust faith, and I didn't know if that was a problem. But I suppose the flip side is that even with the big picture stuff, there is also practical stuff that can get in the way. And so I suppose a challenge to my own community. I now live near Carlisle, which historically had football clubs, a Catholic church which had football clubs, it had boxing clubs, it had social clubs, the beer was cheap, the nights were long. It was that kind of place. It doesn't exist anymore. I don't know what exists just for the males anymore. And I don't mean just for the males to be exclusive, but for males to primarily come together. It doesn't exist. But in those 143 messages, I had 14 invites to join Andy's Man Club. I had 6 invites to join the Freemasons. Those who know anything about us Catholics will know how that went down. I had 3 invites to come to the local mosque. One of them from a woman, actually, who said men need their time together. I had 3 invites to become a Buddhist. I had precisely 0 invites to come to church. I don't know if that is something for us to think more deeply about. Thank you.
Thank you. Dave.
Thank you. As Margaret Thatcher might have said, there's no such thing as community. The Holy Trinity of undergraduate sociology, Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim and Max Weber, they describe the shift from community and tradition through to where we are now, capitalism, rationality. They had different takes on it, but that's broadly what they were talking about. Another sociologist, Ferdinand Tönnies, he talks about Gemeinschaft, community, and Gesellschaft, society, again, describing that shift. The upshot of what they were talking about was that as we gained in human freedom and material well-being, we also lost in terms of having weaker social bonds, more shallow social bonds. We also had this problem of meaning with the decline of religion, as others have spoken about. And also, we were then faced with this issue of having to create new solidarities from somewhere. And I think that's something we're still grappling with. But I think today the discussion of community is quite different. I think those questions remain, but we're not talking about how to organise society anymore, or about the way we organise ourselves as a species, the kinds of settlements, the kinds of relationships we have. We're talking more, I think, about that sense of community, which I think in itself, by talking about a sense of community, we're acknowledging that community as a thing doesn't really exist anymore. So despite the greater freedoms, more mobility, more choices, we still want to feel like we belong. There's a social animal part of us that needs that. Now, my community, and I should do air quotes for this because I don't think community exists in that sense. I don't think they're my community, but I've got no other words for them. They came to national attention with a petition, and the petition was against the opening of Gales. Now, For those of you who don't know, Gales is a chain bakery. And what they objected to most, or partly, was the fact that it was a chain, it wasn't independence. So in part it was snobbery, the snobbery of the village hipsters. They actually live in a place called the Village, and they didn't make that up. I think they would have called it that anyway, but it actually was called the Village. And some unkind people called them the Village Idiots. I couldn't possibly comment, but it was also tribal. The owner of the company that owns Gales, he's also pro-Brexit. He's an environmental skeptic. He's anti-woke. And worst of all, he's pro-Israel. So he didn't accord with their values, essentially. The hipsters also joined the old radical left and the pro-Palestine lobby in the biggest counter-protest in the UK, in my part of North London. The far-right thugs who they were there to protest against didn't turn up, which may be because they didn't really exist in any... I think they were last seen back in the 80s. But also, it was a hoax. But they were very proud of themselves for being there. I think they saw themselves as the descendants of the Battle of Cable Street, and you know they haven't stopped going on about it since on WhatsApp. But I think we might not know who we are, but I think we know that they don't like us. By they, I mean the political and the media elites. I think that they've done their best to shut people up. Or even lock some people up, not just those who took part in the riots, which obviously was a bad thing, but also people who said things out of turn on social media. So I think instead of listening to people and what they were saying, there was just this clampdown. And at the same time, there was an indifference to people's concerns. So burglaries, for instance, across half the country, they aren't even investigated. No burglaries at all are solved in half of areas across the country. Shoplifting has also rocketed. Violent crime in communities, whether it's random violence, knife crime, even terrorist incidents, they're treated as if they're a routine part of daily life. So there's this general sense of indifference to people's worries and concerns. But beyond these violent convulsions, I think we live more anxious, privatized and hybridized lives. And so a singular sense of community to which we might all belong feels more alien than ever, I think. I think you can see that in the conversation about British values. We struggle to actually articulate what they might be. And there's always two words that come up: toleration and diversity. Now, I'm all for toleration, but it's usually toleration of somebody else's values. Toleration of ideas and debate, I think that's absolutely right. But it's interesting, it's always someone else's. It's not, what are our values, for instance? And the discussion about diversity tends to celebrate atomization and to celebrate fragmentation, which are the two things which are kind of what's brought us to this point, that celebration of difference over commonality. So in my view, just to conclude, I think the only way forward is to use opportunities like this, the heat of debate, to forge a new set of values, a new sense of community and belonging through hammering out ideas.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our panel. There's a lot on the... Oh, I can see people already want to speak. So can I see who's got the microphones? What I'll do is I'll take a collection before we come back to you for your reflections.
I was really struck, William, by your finding that book from 1961 and that sense of how people all over the country were taking themselves very seriously, going to meetings, thinking about politics, trade unions, church councils, taking those minutes and really seeing themselves as serious actors within the public sphere and within their public community. And you think that is, I'm sorry, Kate, but very contrasting to the examples that you promoted, in that people are going to a class that they're never going to even advance, or going to a dog training when the dog has been trained. So in some ways, attempting to find community through vacuousness. And I think that is what we're, how do we make ourselves serious citizens again? Because that does seem to me it gave us a depth and a connection and a way of thinking seriously about each other.
There's 2 points I want to make as someone who's trying very hard to build a community where I live. The first is that a community must have some sort of boundary. It can't be everyone is in the community and coming and going as they please, because that's an airport. But I think what's been really crucial for me is to build a community, you have to contribute or aim to contribute more than you take. So for me, it was going to my local church and speaking to the priest after Mass one day and saying, "You haven't got an organist, do you want me to have a go?" And it's very ropey, but it has paid great dividends for me in terms of the community I've managed to get into as a result.
One of the kind of topics that I think a lot of the panelists touched on, even if they didn't necessarily say it out loud, is the role of the economy, our modern economy, how it relates to things like jobs, pursuits of wealth. A lot of people kind of that I know, my age, they want to do things, but they can't afford it. They have to just kind of earn to live for the weekend. And I think when you have that sort of society, it obviously improves living standards in many ways, having a capitalist society. But what it can also do is mean that our lives become kind of interlinked with wealth creation, wealth chasing. And you see also from capitalism the creation of things like technology, which can also directly impact community as well. So I'm kind of keen to just understand what the panelists think about the role of the economy in all this. Do we need a new economy, a new economic system to improve community? Do we need to look into the past at how communities were, like, you had some examples of kind of in the previous decades when communities have been stronger? Do we need to look back to that a bit? And I'm actually a member of the SDP. Obviously, William is as well. He's the party leader. And we believe in something called the social market economy, where you have an economy that generates wealth, but also does protect the society at the same time. So I'm keen if, obviously, talk about whatever your views are on economics in general, but what do you think about the social market economy, for instance? Is that something you would support? Thank you.
Hi there. I live in Scotland. I'd like to talk a bit about logistics. So the community I live in Glasgow used to have 4 community centres. Now it has none. They did a community assessment, charrette, a few years ago and found that the green space available to local children was the equivalent of one A4-sized piece of paper per child. So, in addition, when any initiative that people want to take with no access to actual public space, it meets another barrier. And so this is very disincentivizing for local citizens, where what I've witnessed is it wears citizens down in terms of their own initiatives. So I'm wondering if you can address the very real, and I've heard this across Scotland, I don't know how it is down here, the very real challenge of citizens feeling empowered who want to find community where there's literally no physical space for them to go.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to take one more, then come back to the panel and then go back out.
Thank you. So my name's Oliver, and thank you to all of you. By the way, I love what you're doing. It's great. And I think important that we come together to talk about community. And one of the things that I've been trying to work on recently, so I'm a teacher in Tottenham in northeast London. And I teach MFL and I teach politics. And one of the things I'm quite curious about is how does a sense of community in a very diverse area like Tottenham, how does that impact political engagement and participation in the community? Our actual turnout for the election in 2024 was 52.3%. That's a really, really low turnout, given the fact the max in the last 10 years was actually 67.8. Now, I know that constituency boundary changes can have a large thing to do with that. But I'm just curious to think, what can I do as a teacher in the community to actually try and build a sense of belonging, and how could that link to political participation?
Okay. Panel, Dave, do you want to just begin?
It's interesting, this discussion. Something Michael said, and has been repeated, there's been echoes of it in the audience too. This notion of whenever we talk about men in particular having issues with speaking to each other or having a community, it often gets very therapeutic. And it's presumably it's often women who are organising those groups. I don't think that's a problem as such, but I think that the notion of that therapeutic approach is a problem. But I think it also speaks to the fact that we seem to lack the institutions that speak to people now. So we've talked about the church, and we've talked about community centres and those kinds of things, which have been around for a very long time. And I'm with William. I want to. I should be going to church, not because I believe, but I kind of like the idea of taking my kids there on Sunday, perhaps, because it feels like something I want to do, to be part of the community. And sometimes it's the one place where you have somebody talking in a serious way about something meaningful that everyone's there engaging with. So that in itself is quite unique. But I think we lack that. We don't have the institutions. Young people don't go to pubs as much. There's nothing there that they feel that they can engage with in particular about younger people. So I think we need to. I don't have the answers, but I do think we need to recognise that some of the forms of engagement we have perhaps don't meet up with where people are at the moment.
William, I'm going to come to you.
I'd like to take up the point made by the lady in Scotland and Glasgow. I think it's absolutely crucial that you have somewhere physical to convene, to get, whether it's a sports field or a community centre or whatever. If you don't have that, it doesn't happen. It's closed off and it can't happen. So resources for that are vitally important. When I chair a community council in Northumberland, and when I became chair 5 years ago, there was an area of land, that was just overgrown basically, and I thought that wasn't good enough. And we've changed it completely. It's a small football pitch now. We've refurbished the pavilion, and I cycle past that most days, and there are kids playing football, and I can't tell you what that feels like. They couldn't play football if the football pitch wasn't there. It was literally, cause and effect. So it's basics. We've got to find the people that can run these organizations and bring people together and back them, institutions and facilities. But just, in your city, okay, we have a policy of taxing Premiership football clubs 1%. And you've just got to be more robust, tax those clubs, put that money into new pitches, new 3G pitches. And yes, there probably would be fewer yachts and Ferraris, but it's a price we'd be prepared to pay.
Kim, can I come to you?
Thank you. And thank you to all for the questions and the comments. I feel that when we talk, and table tennis was a great example, there are so many people, maybe even people in this room, who from time to time find it really hard just to get out. And I mean, literally just to get out from where they're living. And whatever the activity is that they choose that makes them feel empowered, because we wish we could make a friend for someone, but we can't. And we wish we could create belonging for someone, and we can't. But what we can do is to work really hard to create the conditions for someone to find their own belonging. So for me, it's any number of things. For however, I'm not good at how many people, but however many people are in this room, you'll all tell me what your belonging is or what makes you lonely, and so on. Care comes into it. This is what I take out of this today, is the importance not only of caring for ourselves, but of caring for others. And the gentleman, I can't see you right now, but the second person who, it's you, okay, that spoke about the importance of contributing, to be able to contribute more than you can take. And so in terms of belonging, for sure, about green spaces, and that's about school and what kids learn, and about economies. That was also a gentleman, sorry, going by your clothes, in a black polo, long sleeve shirt, talking about the role of economy. We need to look at this across all the different sectors. For example, social housing, transportation. If someone has mobility needs, there may be a lovely club that they could join. It could well be table tennis, but what about if they can't get there? If there's not a way for them to get there mobility wise, or if they simply don't just have that person that could be any one of us that could show up as a friend for as long as it's needed. And I don't think that ever went out of fashion. I think we just forgot.
Christopher.
Thank you. I think behind a lot of what people are commenting on lies a question about the language we use to describe things. So in the last 50 years, I think institution and bureaucrat have been demonized. Institution, boo. Bureaucrat, boo. However, if we talk about groups and organizers, the whole thing suddenly is transformed. Oh, groups are good. Organizers are great. but actually it's just a new way of talking about the same thing. But it's interesting how the language changes our feeling about what's going on. So I think my first comment to many of the questions is think carefully about the language we use. Secondly, as regards creating new groups and finding new organizers, it does seem to me, as a person who's not very sporty, that sport is actually really important. Time and again, we find that sporting groups and organizers have a fantastic dynamism. And I love the idea of taxing the elite sports, who make far too much money, especially since most of them began life as small church activities for local young people. It's amazing around the world how many of these elite sports clubs, even in Brazil, started as small church activities in the early 20th century or late 19th. So, and my final comment is, I'm so delighted to hear that so many people want to go to church.
Yes, on a Sunday morning. Michael.
Thank you. I mean, my first thought was that I thought it was incredibly bold, William, for you to involve yourself in the tax arrangements of Glasgow football clubs. That seems like a minefield. So, to take a couple of points, actually, which possibly overlap. I mean, the question of being involved in some sort of meaningful endeavour, not just like a vacuous activity, some sort of meaningful endeavour. And the question of the gentleman at the back, the teacher at the back, about building community. Really stark, isn't it, the data on how, like literally off a cliff, has been the drop in volunteering across society. And I think there's probably lots of complex reasons for that. Loss of social trust, hours spent at work, other commitments, all sorts of things. But one of the smaller, more pragmatic reasons, possibly something we could nudge more easily, is there is an incredible bureaucracy involved in it. So we, as part of my job, we need to find around about 650 school governors to help support our schools. And watching how that has changed over the last 10 years, you need to be mini CEOs to do that effectively. And it feels like that's kind of replicated across all sorts of kind of grassroots associative activities where you've got to, there's got to be like a terrorist evacuation plan and things if your building can fit in more than 100 people. It just feels a little bit, and I think that puts people off. I think the fear of that puts people off. And yet those might be one of the ways that there is some low-hanging fruit there. People being involved in a common endeavour in a local place through volunteer work could be part of the answer.
Okay, it's back out to you. Can I see hands?
Hi, my point's about why volunteering's so hard. I think it's charities as well as what you said. I last summer tried to go out and find things to do, just practical things. I wanted to dig in an allotment, and it was all going well, and nobody was, we were just digging in unison. And then after about 3 weeks, the charity changed its objectives, and there had to be an educational component. And lo and behold, our digging time was halved because we had to listen to a lecture on compost making for half an hour. And then we got to dig, and gradually everyone just left, me included. I want to dig. That's what I wanted. And also, they were listening in on our conversations and having little words with us about microaggressions and this and that. And I couldn't. No. It felt like work. Anyway, so that's my experience.
And I was just thinking about the sort of vacuous spaces and this sort of thing, and just a lot of what really makes someone feel motivated and stuff is a sense of purpose. And I think the idea of a community isn't just going to a place to do something. It's interesting, it's great if it's personally fulfilling, but I was just thinking about something that Chantal Del Sol wrote about where you get your sense of fulfillment from. And in the past, it was about something proactive and going and doing something for the benefit, for the greater good, something that would benefit society, sort of doing your duty to society. And that's what gave people a sense of self-esteem and a sense of fulfillment and a sense of well-being, if we want to talk about it in the current language. And how she talked about how that's changed and become something much more about your identity, which is much more passive. And it's something that you need to go to people, but just to get your own sense of self-worth kind of confirmed. And I think that when you're going to a place to do something because you need that personal fulfillment or you need to feel like part of a community, it's never going to work. It might work for a very short space of time. So I just wonder how we get that sense of purpose back. And I think this thing that's interesting when people are talking about going to places the thing that puts people off volunteering, I think, and puts people off going to something where they may have an opportunity to really contribute something, is this idea that actually it's that no one really wants to hear about their opinions about the way to do things. They have an idea themselves. And I actually think that the people who are organizing the things are probably getting a really fantastic sense of fulfillment because they feel like they've got purpose. But it's no good if everybody doesn't feel involved in that and they don't take other people with them. So I think that I don't really know what the answer is to get that back. But I think really believing that people value your opinion and the way to do things is probably a large part of it.
So I'm part of the Scottish Union for Education, and we spend quite a lot of our time talking about the fact that the state is introducing children who are placed in the state's care to ideas that parents don't accept. So we're quite critical of the failure of the state to safeguard. But it doesn't fit very comfortably with me because I've watched my parents stop doing cricket and swimming and these other things because they had to go through child protection checks. And there's a whole generation of people that have fallen out of the volunteering system for those reasons. I'm wondering whether we could take responsibility for safeguarding back off an overreaching state in the same way as the church takes responsibility for fundraising away from the state. Because if you're tied into fundraising and you're tied into child protection, it's very difficult to give meaning to volunteering in society at the moment.
Thank you. I have a question about boredom. Not today. This has been very stimulating. But boredom in general, I remember being 15 before I had a phone, and boredom was this huge motivator for getting me out of the house. And you were speaking about billiards and darts. And I remember speaking to one of my dad's mates who was beating me time after time and time at pool. And I was like, how do you get so good at pool? And he was like, because I was so bored as a young man. I used to go out and play pool all the time. And it just sort of made me think that whatever you're into now, be it, you're into history or you're into the theatre or something, there's always a better technological substitute at home. You don't have to leave the house. You turn on Netflix, there's all these films, or you go on a forum and you can just do history there. You don't have to go join the local history society. And there are exceptions, run clubs are booming at the moment, especially for young men. And because you can't do running on a computer. Some people have tried, I'm sure, but there are table tennis indeed. So yeah, and Kim's written about how antisocial social media can be, and I think it's a really important idea. So I just wanted to that question about boredom, and in a world of maximum information, is it important that we're bored sometimes? Because it actually gets us out and we find people and we find a purpose, and it's the same with pubs. Younger people, when they go in pubs, pubs can be quite boring. But you sort of have to wait for the right people, or they got to change the barrel or something. And it's not, but we want that instant hit. And I think I don't know, is boredom, the decline of boredom, a motivating factor here, that we don't go out and find people and a purpose, and we end up on social media, which is actually really antisocial. So, but this, just to be clear, this isn't boring.
Hi, I'm not very good at multitasking, so I'm gonna make more of comments and maybe a formulated question. So I found it very fascinating. I think it's interesting because this is something that I think a lot of us would agree on what has been said, regardless of political views and where we come from. Community is important. I empathize with so much what you and Michael said about loneliness. I come from Poland. I'm a gay man. In London especially, it's difficult. It's a big city. It can be very lonely. In my community, there's a lot of drug abuse, alcohol abuse because of loneliness, primarily, I think, and a lot would agree. I actually found my place and my community in Hackney. I'm from South London. Maybe my next stop will be Orkney or Scotland. Maybe about the march. I might have been there, the Walthamstow March, anti-race. So I want to provide a bit of different perspective, maybe. So what you said is right. A lot of people showed up. There was no instigators, or at least I haven't seen any. But what did happen was this amazing sense of community, and we were there for one purpose with same values, and we stood up for something. That was an amazing feeling. And I suppose, I grew up as a Catholic man, go to church every Sunday with my parents. and I moved, probably lost a bit of that. And a lot of young people go away from church for different reasons, for better or worse. So I wonder, maybe my question is, in absence of that, what is a good way of us building a community?
Thank you. Couple of observations. One, to what extent is the church marginalised by the state usurping its traditional roles in providing education, healthcare, welfare to the people in the community? That's been taken away to distant bureaucracy. And second, nobody's really mentioned leadership in communities and their sort of role in establishing a community from a strong leader. But also the darker side of that is that there's places where really quite authoritarian that have a strong community sense. Whether that's like Singapore or Hungary or, I don't know if Christopher regards a monastery as a benign dictatorship, and to what extent that creates the conditions for a community to identify. So,
I haven't been to church for years, not read my Bible for years, still a Christian. But one thing I remember from the Bible was that they started the church in their homes. And it's something that I kept with me, because even if you don't feel like you've got the resources and you've not got anything, you can start right where you are. I know that sounds like a grand idea, but the other thing, which is a P that I'll add to that lady's list, which is a dirty word if you're really not into church or anything, but prayer, because when it's just you on your own, you've still got you and you've still got God, and it can start there. And if you can join with other people that actually do believe in that kind of cranky stuff, you can change things.
I think it's really important that we understand the problem before we jump into solutions. I'm not arguing against community people setting up table tennis groups or whatever, but I do think that just on loneliness, for example, I think it's been completely pathologized. Everybody's felt lonely at some point in their lives. It's a human thing. The question is how you deal with it, and it's society that's changed. And I think also with mental health, the amazing amount of mental health problems that there are today, I think are largely because vulnerability and victim status are the things that get you noticed. And so I think things like resilience, courage, duty, they're not valued anymore. And I think that's one of the things that we really need to push for, is actually changing the way humans are. And the fact that a lot of the discussion is very anti-human, things that are going on in society today, the climate debate is all about human beings not being great. And I think before we can start a sense of belonging, we need to at least believe in humanity.
A variation on the theme from just a moment ago, but what do you think has been the role, if any, of the modern welfare state in crowding out traditional forms of community and belonging, i.e. civil society?
My name's Sarah. I work in a public library. One thing I will say to you is if you don't want to go into a church, go into a library. But most importantly, it has to do with the allocation of resources. And I don't just mean money. I mean, first of all, the library is being hollowed out and we don't have the staffing in the opening hours. But most importantly, when it comes to our events and activities, the question is, I have people coming into my library, oh, I'd love to have a writing club. And I say, yes. And who is going to lead it? Because back in the day when we had more staff, I would be able to do that. So the question is, are members of the public willing to expend their time as a volunteer? And also as an organisation, are our organisations, civic organisations, willing to prepared to resource the staff who are going to oversee this? Because volunteering isn't free. We need someone to supervise and, like you say, to ensure that these volunteers are engaged with and treated with respect and dignity and looked after, because dealing with the public, you deal with anyone. So the question is, are we prepared to have the resources to make sure we've got enough coffee for a cup of tea for someone to come in? Do we have the resources to train someone and keep them engaged as a volunteer? Do we have that trust, and are we willing to do that?
There's more commenting on the other points on mental health. Labour, they want to put a mental health champion or whatever, mental health nurse into every single school. I think that's a terrible idea. And I think that we are pathologizing something which you are talking about. And like you say, that money that you're going to put a mental health nurse in every school, why don't we put it into the library, into the community? I'd love to know what the panel think on this sort of mental health epidemic, which I think is largely manufactured. I'm young, I've got lots and lots of friends. All of them have got various
diagnoses, and they find an identity in that, not in the church or in the community. And I just would like to hear reflections on that.
Okay, I'm going to come back to the panel for a very quick 1 or 2 comments if anybody's got them, and then go out back to you. William, you look like you're jumping.
Yeah, no, well, I just want to agree with the lady at the back who posed the question of who's going to do it. The first chair of the SDP that I worked for was a very able lady from Glasgow, and lots of people had lots of ideas, and her first question was, great idea, who's going to do it? And that's the problem. It is you absolutely need that. But just on a broader point on place, back to place, there's so much churn, the semi-nomadic lives we have, 40% of graduate employment in the UK is in London. And I don't actually think we'll ever really put down roots unless we have the opportunity somehow to stay in one place for a generation. And actually, it's not a model which is available to many people. And I worry actually also about the polarization of this. A lot of people with a lot of wealth and resources, rather than build a community somewhere, they'll move to a community with high trust because it's easier to do, but they're leaving other people behind, and then you're into more polarization. Some people have it, some people don't. A friend of mine about 20 years ago bought a house in the Limousin region of France, and they were doing the sort of ritual of buying it with the notary or the lawyer. And John said, has there been any crime in this area? And they went a bit quiet. I said, actually, there has been some crime. And he was a bit worried. He said, well, yes, someone stole a ladder in 1967. We never found out who it was. So that's a risk.
Kim. Thank you. I first just have to go to the back and say, in praise of public libraries and getting more people involved, I wanted to especially highlight, I think you're here, talking about sense of purpose, and maybe it's about that personal sense of why. And it can be something like, I think I'd like to fly to the moon one day, but it can also be simply what I'm going to do with my day today, and it's vital, and it goes hand in hand with leadership and who are the leaders. And when we're talking about something like belonging, it's not with no disrespect, it's not party political, right? It's all of us working together. And I would say I love what you said about praising boredom, because from that comes curiosity and imagination, and rarely does it leave us sitting at home. And I would also like to add, when we talk about a global mental health crisis, I feel quite confident that there is one. But people who have lots of friends, as you said, that are there to support them, have a much better outcome than feeling stigmatized and so on their own. And finally, for you, that was courageous to stand up and talk about what it's like coming here from somewhere else, and being a gay man, which can still be stigmatized, and what that feeling is of being alone or lonely, and not maybe just for a day or two, but maybe for a long time. So way to go. Christopher, any comment?
Yeah, we haven't talked about solitude. We talked about loneliness, but again, I come back to language. There is a place for solitude. Speaking as a monk, solitude is one of the joys of the monastic life. Now, we could have another whole debate about solitude and loneliness, but I just want to put out there that we have to find a space for solitude as something positive. And again, the way we talk about it. The boredom thing, yes, I spent my life teaching secondary school, and people would say X is boring, Y is boring, and I'd say it's your right to be bored, because that stimulates you. But at the same time, you can teach people to value solitude for a period, which often energizes you to then go out and create community as well. I genuinely think there is a real connection between people who can live moments of positive solitude, now called meditation by, secular society, which is wildly popular. If I speak about prayer, they don't want to know. If I speak about, say, I'm a meditator, the audience picks up. It's fascinating. It's all about the language again. So that there can be a connection between positive solitude and energized to go out and create community. And that's essentially what the monastic life is about. It is this dialogue between moments of intense solitude where the rules forbid you to speak in the period known as the greater silence, and then you have to turn up to lunch. That there is the dynamic between the two. And I think it's something lurking in the back of this conversation too. There's something about hanging on to the transcendence of life. That transcendence is an innate part of life. It's not been invented. It's utterly real. And somewhere in the solitude you connect with that, which energizes you to treat other people really well because they're transcendent people as well.
Dave.
That was a bit of a sermon, I'm sorry.
It's good.
No, I very much agree on the solitude points, but the thing is, I tend to seek that out in libraries. But everybody wants to turn libraries into community hubs. You can't have both. So I've stopped going to libraries because I can't study there anymore. I can't read. There's so much activity going on. So there's a bit of an issue there. But I very much agree with the mental health points that have been made. I spoke yesterday on a session on neurodiversity and the way people are identifying with different type, whether it's autism or ADHD or dyslexia or people who think they're in the wrong body. Those kinds of discussions, I think they reflect this kind of going inwards rather than identifying with people around you and the commonalities. So I very much agree with that. The welfare state points, yeah, I agree. I think there's always that tension. I'm not much sure if the welfare state itself is the cause of it, but certainly the welfare state has changed and become all-enveloping. It's not just a safety net anymore. And that does, I think, inhibit people and their sense of agency. And I always think when I think of volunteering, I've discussed volunteering at various events. And I think if you're thinking about it as volunteering, it probably isn't volunteering. I think it's like when I think about the things I do, I'm a school governor or I take part in events like this, or I don't think of it as volunteering. It's because it has a purpose. You don't give it that name. I think if you're looking for it, there's probably a problem there. It suggests there's something quite vacuous about the whole thing. And just finally on this, the march in Walthamstow, I think it is true that the people on that march have a sense of community. I think it points to another tension that there's this, we're all members of communities and they have boundaries and they're in tension with each other. We can't all be, even though we want to identify with a single thing, we do tend to organise ourselves differently. And I think that's important. And Kim, in her introduction, talked about people who are seeking asylum being invisible. But in a sense, they're outside the membership group. And I think but that isn't a membership group that's actually quite important because as citizens, we belong to a certain entity. And if you're not a citizen, you're not a member of the group. I think that's inevitable and that's a positive, actually. It has implications, but it is a positive. So I don't think we can get a bit kumbaya and say it wouldn't be lovely if everyone's together and we all share the same values, but I don't think it's quite as straightforward as that either.
Michael.
Thank you. Really enjoyed your point about boredom. I think it's really valuable. And just reflecting on myself, whenever I have a moment to myself, I whack on a podcast immediately or whatever it might be. So just giving yourself that time to be bored, I could imagine is quite valuable. I might try it. I'll speak to Mrs. Merrick about that, see what she thinks. Safeguarding. I think a valuable point. We've got to tread very carefully, of course. But I think I think you're edging at something important in the sense that safeguarding has had a bit of mission creep. What would have historically maybe just been called child protection and was really about active risk to children and all the rest of it, seems to have become a little bit of an amorphous thing, a bit of a blob that kind of sits across everything. Even things that are very low risk and maybe things that inhibit people forming relationship. I think, for example, one of my children's cricket teams where the safeguarding policy means that parents can't give lifts to other people's children. Well, that's a nightmare. I mean, we're quite lucky we've got an airport shuttle for transport, but it's a nightmare if you've not got transport. How are you going to be involved in things? And that's all under the guise of safeguarding. Scratch my head on that one. The final thing, I suppose, was just that I was reflecting on is I wonder how. And again, reflecting from the position of someone who's probably quite introverted and wouldn't necessarily go and proactively do things, maybe I should. There is a value to kind of feeling obliged to get involved in something, feeling like it's a duty or maybe not even a choice to get involved and go and do. I suppose in a way, maybe that, I wonder if that's what I was edging at with my wife, who goes along to whether it's the childcare groups or whether it's the local community group. There are like certain social obligations that exist there, but they're not evenly distributed. And so maybe when you don't have them, you don't have the thing that forces you to turn up when you probably wouldn't choose to otherwise. Is there a loss there? I think it would benefit me anyway.
Okay, we're back out to you. Can I see hands?
I'm sure I'm not alone in the experience of having kind of personally tried to run away from every community who's ever tried to have me as a member. I think it's interesting when we're talking about kind of safeguarding and child protection and some of the more stifling efforts of the way we bring communities together today, actually kind of missing the point that community always involves a bit of a trade-off where we put ourselves into a space that can be uncomfortable, can entail things that aren't naturally necessarily what we choose for ourselves. Like community also always has a slightly stifling element sometimes if you go too deep into it. And so I think the part that this conversation would benefit from and comment on, I'd be interested in your comment on, is kind of how do we today make the trade-offs reasonably between what we give up to our communities and what we try to defend for ourselves as autonomous and thinking and relatively free people.
It's just to follow up on that bit of the discussion about how hard it is to sort of characterize the sides in this battle. Because it's definitely not the case that the state is somehow against community. In fact, quite the opposite. I think you could say that there's a whole new vernacular around working at place, that or neighborhoods, anchor institutions, all these kind of neologisms that kind of point to the desperation of the state in some ways for community to come back. I think the problem is that they constantly mess it up, and libraries is a really good example. So I think that it's a really bad thing that money's been taken out of libraries, but it's not the case that, generally speaking, there is still money available to be put into communities, but it's always got to be for something. So a kind of a library just as a space which, you know, people can use to read, but can kind of fill with their own ideas, if you like, that doesn't kind of tick the right boxes now. And you kind of see it in sports clubs as well. And I think the safeguarding stuff's a really good example that there's kind of constantly additional purposes get kind of put onto spaces that just need to be more open. And so there's this sort of weird desperation for community, but an inability to leave it alone. And I guess there's a space in there in terms of the comments around, everyone kind of needs to get off their backsides to do something about this. It's kind of pushing back against that, which I think's, one of the ways we can do that.
You won't be too gloomy about all this. In the sort of leafy suburbs of Birmingham, where I live, there's a very thriving church, very hard-working churley who do more than enough to actually look after the local community. I can't say that I can't praise them enough for what they do. Not only the clergy themselves, not only the vicar, and not only the curates, etc., but their families are all so much involved in what the community does. And I can say that we are very fortunate. Birmingham may be deprived in some ways, but there are other ways in which it is very rich. Thank you.
This dichotomy between negative and positive free freedom is I think, a false dichotomy. Because my view is that without negative freedom, there's no possibility of positive freedom. The second point I'd make is that alienation is part of the modern human condition, and the thing is not to have too much of it. But if we don't have any of it, a sense of being apart from the group on things, then we can't be free. And the third point just is that we have to accept that life is tragic, and that once we accept that, it's very hard to do, I might add, but once we accept that, maybe we can get things in perspective.
The speaker at the end was talking about that maybe we need social obligations, and you were talking about your wife, and it made me think one trend that doesn't really seem reversible at the moment is that people are having fewer children. So I'm now in my 40s. I don't have children. And suddenly it's really like weighing on me that I don't feel I have those obligations. I don't have like, the parent group that I can join in the playground. A lot of my friends have moved out of London. I don't have any family in London except for my partner. I'm an only child, so I'll never be an aunt. So there's just things that's like weighing on me. That's actually pretty common these days, and probably it's only going to increase as Gen Z and younger generations are forging fewer relationships, and they're probably, we're probably going to see the rise in people being single or people not having children, in middle age. So we're gonna have to confront that. How do we create certain obligations that are able to include people who don't have their own families in the community? I'm hoping to look into something like mentoring. I've done befriending for the elderly in my community, but now I feel like I'd like to give back to the younger generations. But it is, it's difficult, and it's when you feel like you don't have that yourself, it can be isolating.
Yeah, my question is more about bringing different communities together. So we can see across the world there's a lot of like civil unrest, religious communities against each other, like social movements versus governments and corporates. So just any insights really on how we can actually bring different communities together so we're not like becoming more disjointed or tearing each other apart.
Hi, I'm Ruth. I was just thinking about the solutions. I hear a lot about call for instrumental solutions. We want more fields, we want money, we want staffing, resources. But actually, I think it's a search for instrumental solutions for what is an intrinsic problem. And the problem to me seems to build a community, you have to believe in something. And anybody can join, whether you have kids or not kids, but it's whether you believe in free speech, whether you believe in helping the poor or teaching the kids to teach art. It's just really, how do we get back to this idea that people believe in things, and then we don't need resources, we just need to do that, whatever we believe in.
Thank you very much. I just want to say, first of all, the idea of the libraries is really, really important. But I just want to sort of say something that's really, really positive. So for the last 10 years, we've been holding, in South London, we've been holding a film festival that goes on for 2 weeks. We've got about 30 volunteers, intergenerational. Our oldest member is 80 and the youngest is in her 20s. Actually, no, we've got some kids that get involved as well. But funding is always a problem. So one of the ways we do fundraise is actually by going out to the community, especially to local shops, and they give us prizes for fundraising. And just for those 2 weeks every year, it takes the whole year obviously to organise, the whole community comes together. And they come together because there's leadership, there's a vision, and then there's people who feel enthusiastic enough, they want to actually be part of a community, a part of something that's going to make their environment a sort of a healthier and a happier place. So I think that's the formula really as well. That's very important. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Really, really interesting discussion. So much in there. If you, in the order that you spoke at the beginning, so beginning with you, Kim, leave us with the one point that you want people to remember.
Okay. That's hard. I think it comes down to there are no barriers here to belonging. There are no you don't have to sign up and be a member. You don't have to go and volunteer. You don't. Those of us that get a lot out of it, yes, let's do that. But by simple virtue of the fact that we are born, we all have an inherent right of belonging. And when it comes to the excellent examples and questions that have been raised today, I'll come back to one of the most covered topics was about church and going to church, and also reminding everyone that there are many other faiths, including the Jews, Muslims, everyone. So we need to have not only tolerance, but understanding and acceptance. But my last and final thought is I love circles, but whatever that circle is, including if it's the circle of your church community, It's not only what happens on Sunday or whatever your day of worship is, it's what do we take out of that belonging that we feel and experience to everyone else around us.
Thank you, William.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure to take part in this. Great fun. I want to link my closing comments back to place. I think it's all about place. I think the economic model that we've had just involves high churn, everyone's moving around, until we get to a place where people can stay in one individual parish or location, build a life, possibly raise a family, and literally just stay there. Just stay there. That's if we can get that, and I think the community spirit that we may have had in previous generations will be regenerated. And I want to finish on an optimistic note, because I think actually hybrid working and the extent to which, if you're not actually physically making something, a lot of us can decide where to live and stay there. And you could be doing an activity that may be even international, possibly even from a location like Orkney. So I think that may be the solution in the end.
Mm-hmm. Christopher.
I think that lots of insights about different ways to resolve the issue, but I think that we would, what I would leave you with is what I've mentioned along the way. The way we talk about these solutions is really important. So, for example, talking about my identity and how do I actually talk about my identity in a way that's open to others' identities is really important. So I think there is a challenge, a very practical challenge, but one of the ways that all of us can approach those is by being very thoughtful about the way we speak about the challenges and about the solutions, and trying to make sure that our language allows for a positive approach. So we don't catastrophize this. There is a lot of talk of catastrophe around loneliness. Everything these days, by the way, is an emergency. It used to be a problem. Now everything's an emergency, which I really hate. So these are not catastrophic. They've always been issues. They're highlighted more nowadays. But if we approach them with non-catastrophic language and in a positive way, I think we can make more progress. I'm so struck by the positivity of everybody in the room, that everybody wants to address this problem. I thought that it was just me, and now I discover it's everybody.
You're not alone. Michael.
So in 1905, a newspaper called the Daily News ran a comment series called "What's Wrong with the World," and it would ask contributors to say what they thought the problem was. And G.K. Chesterton responded with a very short response. It just said, "I am." It seems to me that that's like the seeds of an action plan here, that actually, as much as we're all very good at identifying the problem, do we always recognize that we're also the solution? Every generation has had to figure this out, and I don't see any reason why we won't neither. So that's my note of positivity.
Dave.
On William's place point, we haven't really discussed that aspect of community much at all, but I think it goes back to what I was saying before. It's very difficult to locate community these days. We have, well, I may be speaking for myself, I have quite a shallow relationships with my immediate neighbours, in terms of, I don't know them particularly well, I might know their names, but there isn't that sense of, I belong to that community. A lot of people, well, some people work at home. For those of us that commute in occasionally, people tend to, they're on their phones. They tend not to intervene if there's any problems on the bus or on the tube. So people are kind of living in their own little worlds there as well. And the workplace, which used to be a centre of community, as a consequence of these sorts of changes, that's not the case either. So that's the downside. We finding that sense of community is very difficult, I think, these days. On the other hand, I think there are opportunities there. There are always opportunities for people to actually do things, and people, have said that. And we could all volunteer. We can all take part in our communities. And I think that has to be it feels inadequate, but I think it is something we have to do. It's only by actively trying to create those kind of connections with people through events like this, even, that we can actually start to kind of re-establish the kind of solidarities and the kinds of community or a sense of community that we feel we can belong to, and that will meet those kinds of needs.
Thank you to the panel.